This is Tekton's health in a solo CM, 450 HP. This is also Tekton's health in a solo CM, but as you see, it's much lower. So, how is this possible is probably what you're asking. One answer: CoX scaling. So if this isn't new information, it's info that is literally out there in the public, and you can even screw around with the CoX scaling calculator within the description if you want to see how scaling works. But let's do a quick history lesson and then explain briefly how scaling works. Eons ago, the raid scaled based on the total average combat level of your raid party, with the combat level affecting the health of NPCs in Chambers, and HP affects the stats such as attack, defense, and so forth. I'm unsure if health average was taken into account in the past, but combat 100% did. Because in the early days of CMs, when players did it only for the dust and kill count, they'd have a level 3 skiller go in and handle prep. Since in a 7-man team of 6 max players and 1 skiller, the average would jump down to 108, meaning all NPCs would have much lower health. I believe a select few teams did this, with 2 notable skillers doing this: Shiguma Rika and Hooray for J, who were skillers going for the omelet. And if HP average was taken in account, then the defense of all NPCs would also be lower. Well, except Olm. Olm scaling is dependent on team size and if CM is on or off for offensive and defensive stats, while the health will always be the same between normal and CM. I'm unsure if it averaged out to be better with having 1 less player for a large part of the raid, but lowering the health of NPCs by around 16% was still mighty helpful. But if the average raid level falls below 115, you'd get reduced points per damage on NPCs, and it's quite the nerf if you're trying to make some coin. Then again, CM wasn't really good for profit versus normals in that time period, so only a few players were abusing this mechanic. Another note was that 115 combat isn't where the raid stops scaling, as NPCs scale all the way up to 126 in the Chambers of Xeric, and seem to scale down all the way to combat level 60. It's just the level needed to get the max points per damage. With that mention, outside of the niche CM case, players who raided with lower combat friends were being punished if the average was below 115, so Jagex made a change to instead look at the player with the highest combat over the average when scaling the raid, which a lot of players liked, since now 115 accounts could raid with their lower combat friends and it would scale to the player with the highest combat. The only people that weren't happy were the skillers, who were now rendered obsolete for scaling down CMs, as it would scale to 126 or whatever the highest combat player was. Much later in the future, there'd also be a change where if you talk to the chasing guy outside, you can choose to scale it to the max at any combat level as a toggle for teams below 115, wanting to get max points still. But with that history lesson, I'd like to talk about an idea backed up with some simulation data. So the idea is to run accounts with lower combat stats without harming your offensive output in order to lower the health of all NPCs in Chambers outside of Ulm. So here's the theoretical build of low drawbacks for team runs. 77 prayer, which might require a little bit more flicking or might make Vasa a little bit more annoying. 80 defense, access to Torva, Pharaohs, and so forth. And lastly, a max in all the other stats. You could, in theory, also limit health to 94, meaning you'd get max heals from Xeric aids. However, trying to train all combat stats and keep 94 HP is pretty annoying, and the fact you'll get so much health XP over the course of doing runs just makes it not so feasible. This brings your combat from 126 to 118 while still having access to max DPS gear, just slightly squishier. Tekton's health drops from 450 to 420, which is about a 7% nerf, and it differs a bit on other NPCs too, but give or take is about 70% all around for every single NPC in the raid. Now, let's talk about some simulation data. At 450 HP, assuming vulnerability, max strength, and max damage, super combat Inquisitor, you have about a 18.2% success rate of a 1 anvil Tekton, with around 500 no anvils in 1 million attempts. What about at 420 HP? You have a 24.4% chance of a 1 anvil, and out of 1 million attempts, 2,300 no anvils. So of course it'd be better if I had a bigger sample size for no anvils, but you get the picture. That cut in health is pretty strong for getting no anvils, and it also slightly increases the chance of a 1 anvil. Now, less prayer means you heal less from redemption, which is bad for Vespula, and it also can be harmful for the Kirby skip, which is specifically for solo CM. So in that case, you could probably go for something like 95 prayer and still have 120 combat, which would still be a 5% health nerf to all NPCs outside of Ulm. But now let's take a look at Vasa, which is where things get more impactful. Killing Vasa before it reaches a crystal is a staple in team speedrunning, easily obtainable in normal chambers, but in CMs it's not as easy. Solos, on the other hand, you'll rarely see one in normal solo runs. As for solo CM, you're probably not going to see one at all. So let's start with normal chambers in a 7-man. Vasa has 1200 HP. Now, with 7 ZCBs and Ruby Bolts, you can hit up to 770 damage, assuming all 7 ZCB specs hit, and Vasa start is usually the go-to for speedruns, so everyone would be 121 HP, meaning the Venge recoil damage per player is going to be 357 Venge damage. So, best case scenario, you'll do 1127 damage, and Vasa will be left with 73 HP. Now, of course, recoil rings would boost it with an additional 49 damage, but that's still not enough to one-shot it, meaning you'd have to do one more bow hit. But what if everyone ran 120 combat? Then the health would go from 1200 to 1140. What about 118? It would go from 1200 to 1120 and so forth. So in normal team chambers, the lower prayer won't hurt as much, so a 118 build is pretty realistic, and with the reduced health, you could go from needing to do one bow shot no matter what, to potentially killing Vasa right off the bat with just ZCB specs and Venge damage. Crazy, right? It's pretty crazy. But now let's look at CM5s. We're going to compare 126 versus 120 combat. So that would be 1350 HP versus 1282. So with our current gear and with ZCBs, the chance of a no crystal is about 14.7%. What about at 120 combat? The chance of a no crystal is now 27%. Over a 10% increase of a no crystal. And again, with how optimized chambers speedruns are, every time save counts, so getting a no crystal could make or break a record, PB, etc. So yeah, even if it's only a partial nerf on health, that reduction in health can easily boost the odds of a no crystal or killing a Vanguard before its next dig cycle and so forth. I sadly don't have all the free time in the world to make every type of simulation for every scale and every scenario, but I think the presented data here gives you the picture, and a 5% nerf on health for all NPCs but Ulm at the cost of no DPS loss is still a win. Now this isn't even considering the odds with new prayers, which of course this is unrealistic, but let's have fun for a moment. Right now we'll look at the prayers in their beta form, so these are of course up for change, but here's the thing. Those prayers had no defense requirement mentioned, so unlike Piety, Rigor, and Augury, which require 70 defense, everyone can use them. And we have access to the lower defense Missouri as well, with the same offense only requiring 30 defense, as well as Inquisitor, which is 30 defense, and that's kind of the main set that you use in solo CM anyway. Now, of course, without Ancestral and the Sim Deceive drawback, I don't think super low defense is going to be the move, but there are already purists who run solo CMs, namely Zerkers, so this would mean they could run solo CMs with much better DPS output than before, with access to the new prayers, with better offensive power than Piety, Rigor, and Augury, where they only had access to ultimate strength and so forth. They would only need a 92 prayer at a minimum to have Gambit unlocked, but they'd still be low combat of about 111, which is a 13% nerf on the HPs of all NPCs but Ulm. That's a pretty hefty nerf. Just remember that a Zerker has no Prims, no Vernic, no Pharaohs, and no Ancestral, which hurts the Shadow DPS a whole lot. But with access to max range damage output compared to the normal solo range setup, it might not be the end of the world for them, and they could potentially get close times to main accounts in CMs and normal solos. the amount of damage they would take would be a bit high, especially at Vangs, Ulm, and Metadal. So for CMs, it's unrealistic that this is going to become the speedrun meta. On top of the fact that Ulm, no matter your combat, stays the same, so you'd always have to be ready to face the same Ulm no matter the stats. But what about an account with 80 defense and 92 prayer? You'd still have access to the best gear like Torva and Pharaohs for teams, and you won't be as squishy as a Zerker. And you'd still have access to the best prayers, still having a decent prayer level regarding redemption heals and how much prayer you get from restores, and so on. So a 120 combat build is actually realistic for solos and teams, whereas right now for team runs, you could drop to 77 prayer if you don't mind a bit more flicking. You might not need 92 prayer either, unless that's what the best prayer in the prayer book requires, but again, we don't know. This is me assuming off of the beta prayers. But how does this information make you feel? That if you want to run for the Chambers record, you need to make a brand new account and purposefully neuter your defense and prayer by some levels just to run for a record. And for team raids, you'd also need a pot with players of the same build, because otherwise it's going to scale to the highest combat level account. Would you be willing to make the account, or is it just too much work? Should Jagex again adjust how scaling works to prevent something like this becoming the meta, or should it be left alone? Leave your thoughts in the comment section. In my personal opinion, I'm kind of unsure. It is a bit different from what the norm is regarding trying to run for, raid records. Look at Tob. You want to be max combat for Tob. It doesn't scale off of lower combat, whereas TOA, it scales off of the raid level via invocations. So this would kind of be that anomaly that makes Chambers kind of unique. So in a way, it is kind of cool. But at the same time, I could see people being upset by it because, hey, you're a max account, you're assuming that you're going to have the max DPS and it's going to be the best way to run for records. But now you have to run with lower combat accounts just to try to go for record because, hey man, having lower HP on all NPCs throughout a raid is going to help better your odds to get a record. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up my thoughts. Until next time, guys, farewell.